So this is really, and in some sense, this is a paper about COVID, in the sense that we want to think about what's going on with tightness in the labor market over the past couple of years, because by many measures things look fairly tight. I'm going to show you today things are even tighter than what those measures would normally imply. But on a bigger scale and a more academic contribution, what I really want to talk about today is a different way to think about labor supply that's going to come out of this exercise and come out of these facts. And labor supply is going to play a big role here. But and I'll show this in a few slides. What I really want you guys to kind of take away is, how do we think about, or should we be thinking about extensive versus intensive margin adjustments on what we're going to call labor force participation? So the notion that there are people outside of the labor force that may necessarily want to come back to work, but not all of them are going to want to look to work all full time, all part time, so on and so forth. That the amount of work they're willing to do if they reenter the labor force is going to vary, and that's going to be driving a lot of what I show you today. Okay, so this paper actually builds on earlier work we did with Giorgio Topa. In an earlier paper, we derived what's called the aggregate hours gap. I'm going to show you the same measure, and we're going to work through the details of how we calculate this measure in a slightly different way to account for the pandemic. The aggregate hours gap is what we developed to be a broader measure of labor market underutilization, so broader than, say, the unemployment rate, measuring underutilization. It's driven, or we derive it in large part from a survey we developed a while back called the Job Search Supplement to the New York Fed Survey of Consumer Expectations. It has a broad range of information on people's job search behavior, job search outcomes, offers, acceptances. But we also ask a wide range of questions related to reservation wages and reservation job values, including their desired work hours. So what I'm going to show you here is a measure that measures essentially underutilization, the hours gap, is the difference between people's desired work hours and their actual work hours. And we're going to measure this across everybody, not just the employed versus the unemployed, but those out of the labor force as well, because we have that information. And use that as our measure of aggregate labor market underutilization.
How do you want to think about that in the context of my desired work hours depends on my wage?
So in the survey itself, the desired work hours question follows a question about their reservation wage. So you should be thinking about it as their desired work hours given their reservation wage answer in that sense. Okay. Now I should also mention the COVID fixed effect here too is the earlier paper I just cited was actually the original one. I told Faberman and the guys that we were going to present when this was the pre-COVID planning. So in some sense, things have moved on, but also come full circle. Okay. So like I said, the contributions here are going to be the extend this measure from the earlier paper, quantify the role of reduced labor supply and kind of the main empirical facts I'm showing you, and then provide at least some suggestive evidence. We don't have direct kind of causal evidence for variety of reasons, data reasons, but at least some suggestive evidence that what's going on with the pandemic is going to be driving some of these labor supply issues. Okay. So like I said, the key contribution is this use of the desired hours information we have from our survey. Just so you know exactly what the data is, the survey questions here. So assuming you can find suitable additional work, how many hours per week will you prefer to work at this new job? Underlying that is at this reservation wage you just answered. Okay, so it gives a direct measure of an individual's willingness to work. In the survey, it's asked of everybody who either wants a job or says they want a job or says they have searched for a job in the last 4 weeks. And for the people we don't have it for, we can impute it because if you don't answer yes to either of those questions, you're implicitly perfectly happy with your current situation, which is either working 0 hours out of the labor force or working whatever your usual hours are employed. So we have this measure for everybody. And like I said, our measure of underutilization is going to be this aggregate hours gap, the difference between what people actually work and what they report as their desired work hours.
So you just said it, but I even see you talked about it before, but remind me. So if who gets this question?
Right here. Everybody who because in the earlier part of the survey we asked them to either search for work or if they say they didn't search for work, would you take an offer if one was made to you?
If you know in the CPS there's actually a fairly amount of flows from out of the labor force.
Yes.
Even in the out of the they say they don't want a job.
Yes.
And they flow. So in principle those people wouldn't answer this question.
No, but we're going to impute a value for them. So if they're non-employed and they said no to both of these questions, we assume that their desired hours is 0, right? If you've neither searched and you say no, I would not take a job if it's offered to me, I'm assuming your desired hours are 0. For the employed who say no to both of those questions, we're assuming they're perfectly content at their current job, so their desired hours are imputed as their usual hours. Okay? And we can get more into the measurement. I'm going to go through the details. This is like the simplest math I've done on a paper in ages. It's really just weighted averages. There's a regression, but it's not even like a estimating regression. It's to kind of clean up the data. So, but we'll work through all the weighted averaging details in there. But that's what it's going to be. Okay.
So you don't have this issue of my wife's not working, she doesn't really want to work, but, we paid her $1,000 an hour, and she'd be happy to work.
Yeah. So if we're in a world like that where you throw that level of a wage at someone, maybe they'll be willing to work. No, I mean it's really going to be
That's not what we see today,
no, and I think the most compelling picture I'm going to show you here is the histograms of what the desired work hours actually look like and how it's changed pre-COVID and during COVID, and that's just data and that's what people are reporting. But the key point here is there's going to be this huge shift in those desired work hours during the pandemic that's going to be driving our aggregate results.
And wages are not changing. And with no wages are not changing.
No, reservation wages are going up. That's going to be part of our supporting evidence that's saying, that this may be related to COVID, that people are desiring a higher reservation wage on the order of about 6 log points during the pandemic relative to before the pandemic. And that's going to be pretty consistent within various demographic groups, ages, and so on. Okay, so to summarize what I'm about to show you, so like I said, this expands on earlier work. In our earlier paper, the main point of putting together this aggregate hours gap was to look at the labor market post-Great Recession, and the fact that wage growth was fairly low, even though unemployment had gone down. And our point there was that post-Great Recession, our aggregate hours gap actually showed a more sluggish response of labor market slack coming down, which was consistent with the weak wage growth we saw. So essentially, back then, and in both cases, what I'm going to show you today in the earlier paper, it was the people that were out of the labor force that was driving everything. So
if you before COVID, compare your measure with what you would get if you just took like the unemployed plus the involuntary part-time times like.
I'll show you relative measures.
Like that, would you track pretty well? I'm saying you take the CPS and do the series. Would you track?
You mean the underemployment, the U6 measure?
The CPS you have is like involuntary part-time.
Yeah. So in our earlier paper, we look at that. It turns out the post-Great Recession deviations are actually the involuntary part-time are picking up different patterns than what our measure picks up.
Okay.
So obviously, both of them are telling you a different story than what the CPS is picking up. Essentially, the underemployment measure from the BLS is essentially capturing a same cyclical pattern, but with a different group of people. So it kind of amplifies that slack. We're actually finding a different pattern. We're finding this interaction with the out of the labor force. Essentially, the anecdote I kind of always use when I talk to people about this paper is kind of retired people going back to the labor force to bag groceries or work at a reception's desk, in the sense that they say they're retired in the CPS, they're obviously out of the labor force, but they'll bounce in through these NTE flows, but it's going to be a very different job than a full-time job other people are taking.
One thing you surprised me a little bit is that maybe this is like a subtle point, is part of the Great Recession sluggishness. I'll say more. I've done it with Kepler Abraham. Is the huge increase in long-term unemployment, and so relative search intensities are much lower for the long-term unemployed, and you get a pretty big kick out of that. Do your findings suggest that do you even look at that for long-term?
Yeah, so we're going to break out. I'm going to show you. We're going to break out because what we're going to end up doing is we're going to take the desired hours data from the New York Fed survey, from our job search, and match it to individuals. So we're going to have to essentially estimate, try to split it out in the most heterogeneous way that the New York Fed survey allows us, then match it to those same characteristics of people in the CPS. And one of the ways we're going to do that is a very detailed labor force states. And so it's not going to be the standard EUNN. It's going to be we break out short-term and long-term unemployed as well. What ends up happening is because the way the desired hours work out for short and long-term unemployed, you essentially get the same picture you would get with the CPS data for unemployment. But where you really get the deviation with our measure from the BLS stuff is with the out of labor force guys. So that's the point. It'll all make more sense when I show you the actual pictures, I think. So if we could hold off a little bit, but if other questions come up, obviously come up. Or obviously ask them. So in the earlier paper, the post-Great Recession point was things were more sluggish. For today, the story for the pandemic is the opposite. Is that the guys that are out of the labor force, the retired guys going back to bag groceries and so on and so forth during the pandemic, they decided, you know what, I don't need to bag any groceries. I don't need to go work at a reception desk. Their desired hours contracted quite a bit. And as a result, our aggregate hours gap measure is actually showing a much tighter labor market during the pandemic than what the CPS unemployment rate is showing. Right? And as a result, I'm going to show you that, and I'll show you it's about half a percentage point in terms of the total population or the labor force, lower than the unemployment rate. But what's really driving this thing is really what's going on with desired work hours. So our average measure of desired work hours compared to the labor force participation rate. I'm going to show you that desired work hours dropped about twice as much as the participation rate did in the U.S. And for those that don't know the U.S. data, the participation rate dropped quite a bit right at the onset of the pandemic and stayed flat thereafter. And even now, it's still quite a bit lower than it was at pre-pandemic levels. And I'm going to show you the deviation between these, between what went on with desired hours and what went on with labor force participation is almost entirely driven by the changes in work hour preferences of those out of the labor force. Yeah.
Do you know the payments that they're getting? Are some of those out of the labor force, like former Uber drivers that are now getting unemployment?
We're not going to know. We're not going to know recent payments. I mean, we do have some information on whether or not they have UI payments and so on. It's a fairly small group that report those in our data. I mean, during COVID, it goes up a bit more. I mean, the problem is I'll get into the data slide in a couple slides. The New York Fed survey that we use, our job search supplement, is only 1,300 people a year. So we can only slice it so far. And when we do have numbers like this, it's a decent amount of people. There's only 100 and something unemployed, and of those, if a third of them get it, then you're only dealing with 50 people. So we sometimes get results like that, but they're very imprecise, or we just don't have enough data to even slice it the way we want to. So we can only say so much on it. But it's going to be across all age groups. It's going to be lower skill guys. It's not going to be much of a difference between men and women. So it's not this story of women dropping out of the labor force to take care of kids. I'll show you that women's child rearing burdens definitely go up, but it's not causing them to drop out or reduce their desired hours any more than or that much more than men's. But it's also not too big a difference younger versus older workers, or at least prime age versus older workers. The really difference you see is kind of lower skill guys seem to get hit more, but otherwise it's pretty broad based.
And they also have a lot of payments, right? Lower skills.
In some sense, yes, but then like I said, for our results, they would have to be out of the labor force entirely. I'm actually going to show you. So if you think these guys end up staying marginally attached instead of dropping out entirely, so they're in the out of the labor force want work category, that category actually continues to contribute positively to the measure. So in other words, it's still showing a decent amount of slack in the labor market. Its component, at least in our measure, is showing a decent amount of slack. So if those guys are just saying they want work but not searching, there's a decent amount of them. Their desired hours haven't changed much, and they're contributing positively. It's the out of the labor force guys that are either other reasons or retired that are driving a lot of what I'll show you. Okay, and then the way we put together this measure, doing a counterfactual exercise is actually pretty easy. So the job search supplement that we use to match these data to the CPS only runs from about 2013 to 2021. And like I mentioned, it's fairly small, and we use predicted measures that we match. So to get our baseline measures, we essentially have a discrete change within demographic groups and within labor force states. We have a discrete change in their desired hours 2013 to 2019 versus 2020 and 2021. Okay, so to do the counterfactual exercise, we just estimate what our aggregate hours gap measure would look like if everyone had the same desired hours that we measured from 2013 to 2019. right? And when we do that, we find that the change in the aggregate hours gap that we observe in the data would actually, or if we ignore that change, would actually increase the hours gap measure. So about a 12.5 percentage point, 12.5% higher measure of underutilization, and it accounts for all of the discrepancy we see between the labor force participation rate and average desired hours. Okay. And then the last thing, hopefully I have some time to show you, is that if we look at some supplementary evidence, so special questions on COVID we had in our data set, and some special questions the BLS actually had in their and in the CPS about why are you not searching, if whether or not you're not looking for work or whether or not you're only looking for part-time workers due to COVID, and some other stuff on the reservation wage and so on. Essentially, I'm going to show you some supporting evidence that COVID likely obviously played a big part in this, but when it comes to the persistence of this decline in desired hours, the persistence and decline in labor force participation, it can't explain what's going on in 2021. There's a much smaller fraction of people reporting that they don't want to work or they're not looking for work in 2021 because of COVID relative to 2020.
You see red state, blue state gaps in this?
We haven't split things out by states. We could. I think where the red state, blue state gaps affect our data is people getting sick. Because one of the things, so we use actual hours for a reason to actually capture people not at work for various reasons, and we make some adjustments so it's not just vacations and so on. But we use that, to capture these effects of people not at work and not producing stuff. And as a result, you get some notable spikes in the contribution of employment or the employed, and it's entirely driven by people getting sick or people's place of work being closed down and so on and not being able to work. And that's just from the case, looking at the case COVID case data, that's disproportionately happening more after the first wave in red states versus blue states. So that's where it shows up in our data. Although I'm not going to have any state level stuff here as a contributor, but in terms of other things going on, we haven't really looked at the state level variation.
And you don't ask. You don't know whether the Democrats or Republicans.
No, because we don't have any of that information in the job search supplement. And then the only thing we're really using the job search supplement for, other than the supporting evidence, is this desired hours measure, and then the demographics that we use to match to the CPS. And then once we do that, we have what the CPS has in terms of cross-sectional variation, time series variation. So it would be, we would have state data in the CPS to kind of look at state variation at kind of a more aggregated level, but we couldn't say anything more detailed than what the usual basic CPS data. Okay. So to kind of fix ideas, I think we may have already kind of gotten halfway through here, is thinking about this hours gap measure, the unemployment rate, or any measure of labor market underutilization, at their core, they're fundamentally equal to this ratio here. I just say slack here. We can say underutilization if we want to take a nuance about wage pressures versus just kind of looking at labor by itself. But it's a ratio of gap to labor supply. The ratio of gap to labor supply, right? So if you think about, how is the unemployment rate a ratio of a gap to a labor supply? Well, the gap is the number of people who want work, have searched for work, but don't have a job, right? Whereas the labor supply in the unemployment rate is the labor force, the number of people who either have a job or are looking for a job, okay? That's what we count as labor supply. For the aggregate hours gap, it's going to take a broader view of that in the sense that the gap is just going to calculate across all people. It's essentially going to hours weight bodies in terms of their gap being the difference between desired and actual hours, and labor supply being the average number of hours everybody wants to say they want to supply to the labor market, right? Whether they're employed, unemployed, or out of the labor force. So in that sense, it's a measure of labor supply that's measuring people's actual willingness. Okay.
Would you be happy instead of calling it slack, a measure of effective searchers? So why do I ask that? Because in a Diamond Morrison Tisseriti model, what we really want is vacancies and effective searchers, not just the unemployed. And we like to take into account their search intensity.
Yeah.
So in some respects, this is kind of a proxy for
a little bit, and I think the short answer is yes. I think there's some caveats we want to think about in terms, in terms of, is there something going on here? So, for example, if we're thinking about the probability of people transitioning without job offers, for example. You know, how much is that mattering for that labor force guys? I don't have a good answer for that.
Suppose you took this and you plugged it into what you, Steve, and I did,
Uh-huh.
and asked how well you can explain variation in job finding rate and filling rates
Mm-hmm.
with your using instead of unemployed, using your gap measure.
I don't know.
You see what I'm going?
Yeah, I see where you're going. I see where you're going. I'm guessing pretty well. I'm only saying that because in our earlier paper, we actually looked at how much these, you know, how well we do relative to other measures in predicting wage pressures, and it does at least as well as a lot of other measures, especially when we break things out by its employed as the labor force unemployed components. So I'm going to say the short answer is like, yes, you can think of it that way, and yes, it probably does pretty well, but we haven't actually done that exercise. Okay. So like I've already said, we're going to use two data sources here. One is this job search supplement that we've worked on in earlier work across a couple papers now, where the key measure we're getting is this desired work hours variable I've talked about. We have the data. The data start in 2013. We have their annual cross sections of individuals each October. So the October date is fairly important when you think about what's going on with shutdown. So in 2020, our wave of SCE respondents are going to be about 6 months after everything was shut down. And then in 2021, it's actually kind of as the economy is starting to heat up, wage growth and quits and job growth and so on is pretty strong. Okay. And then we're going to match these desired work hours estimates based on labor force status and demographics of individuals, a predictive measure of these things, to the current population survey, and just essentially just the monthly individuals and the basic monthly files going back to 1994. And then when we measure the gaps, well, we use the CPS for two reasons. One, it's the longer time series. Two, more than two reasons. Two, it's a more robust source of a representative population in the 1,300 people a year we have in the SCE. And then three is we can use these actual work hours with these reasons for leave that we can kind of adjust to make sure they're capturing some measure of underutilization and not some idiosyncratic things going on. Okay. This describes the sample frame. It's going to be all individuals 18 to 79 over this period. Like I was telling John earlier, we're going to use a detailed set of 9 labor force states to kind of put in as much heterogeneity in this matching process that the SCE data is going to allow. So 4 employed states will be full-time versus part-time and single versus multiple job holders. The unemployed, we're going to only be able to split between short-term and long-term unemployed. And then out of the labor force groups are going to be those that say they want work, which is the broader group of those that are usually called marginally attached or discouraged and so on. Retired, and then all other. We're all other, the students, disabled, caretakers, homemakers, so on and so forth.
So can you do anything, I know you said no on the red state, blue state, but like city, whether you're in the city or not?
I mean, in theory, I think there's like a urban versus urban area versus non-urban area variable in the CPS that we could look at, but
Do you have anything equivalent to the other data?
we have. I mean, we have the internal data, so we have the zip codes. We could do something like that. What did you have in mind?
I still have in mind that Republicans and Democrats respond completely different.
Mhm.
And so what you might see is that there might be this big shift in cities, which are primarily
Okay.
Democrat, and maybe outside the cities, primarily Republican. Do you see these changes in hours hitting those areas wildly different?
I see. So you're thinking that as case rates rise in redder states on average, let's say,
They don't
that
respond in the same way.
right. Well, I mean, I guess the suggestive evidence that I'll show you probably would say that you would expect even more tightness there because you would have expected a larger contraction in hours. If it based on suggestive evidence, I'm hoping to finish up here, that shows that COVID is likely driving some of this drop in hours. That would be my prior.
The point is actually the marginal response to the cases are going to be different in red and blue states. That's a really interesting question.
Okay.
Yeah, like,
Yeah,
I talked about this,
Mhm.
jobs that require social contact. Republicans are going, it's not going to affect their response, whereas if you're worried about COVID,
Mm-hmm.
then it does affect.
Okay. Yeah. When I get to the supporting evidence, let's go back to this point. But no, this is a good point. We can try and split the data like that, and or at least high case rate places versus low case rate places, which are essentially for most periods, but not all periods. Red versus blue. But we could also
I don't know.
We could-
High case rate, I think it's still cities. It hit harder.
earlier on it was, but from like July, September 2000 forward, it's the multiple waves, or with the exception of the last Omicron, is primarily red states. or the biggest amplification. Anyway, okay, so matching, we're going to match on broad groups for demographics, again, because of the size constraints of the data. Gender, 3 age categories, and 2 education categories. So when we put all these, the 9 states plus gender, age, and so on, we in theory have 108 categories that kind of match, but there's sparse cells for a lot of these and empty cells for a lot of these. So we end up using only 39, and then collapsing those groups based on who has similar average desired hours and who are just similar in terms of other characteristics. So it's an unbalanced panel. And then in addition to that, we're going to use, instead of just using the averages within those cells, because there's a lot of sampling error that might be driving changes between pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, we're going to estimate essentially predicted desired hours within each of those groups by regressing desired hours on a bunch of demographic characteristics. A bunch of demographic characteristics interacted with each other, and then those things interacted with the dummy for whether it's the pandemic 19 or 2020, 2021. And then we'll use the predicted estimates from those coefficients. We'll take the weighted average of those predicted estimates from that regression and use those as the cell means for those 39 groups.
Maybe this is earlier, but do you have any data that allow you to measure feasibility of working from home by any chance?
So it's going to be implicitly in some of the supporting evidence we have on. So what I'm going to show you is that occupations that required a higher degree of social contact, and we're going to measure a degree of social contact using estimates from a couple of papers. One looked at how much the occupation needs face-to-face contact, and then how much the occupation from Dingle and Neiman, how much the occupation can be plausibly done from home. The quick punchline is essentially low. We find no change in desired hours among guys that have low social contact, and the ones that have a moderate or high level, actually, that's where we see the drop.
Where do you think, it's a slightly related question, but I'll say, just saying, where the self-employed fit into this, particularly, here's the thing, so I've been spending a ton of time about this enormous surge in new business applications, including for people who basically want to go out on their own.
Yeah.
So how do they even answer your kind of question? So, I'm what do you mean by desired hours?
Yeah.
It's really, okay, I'm thinking about wage and salary, and then I'm thinking about going out on my own. And then the desired hours question doesn't seem like it's the right question anymore.
We so partly because of this, we actually don't ask the search questions to the self-employed because it's not part of the issue when we designed the survey for the self-employed is that when you ask them if they're searching for work, it's not going to be clear if they mean they're searching for a new job or they're searching for business, right? We wanted labor, not output.
But I'm thinking about people who are, whether they're self-employed or not now, that are thinking about becoming self-employed, right? So there's at least prima facie evidence that lots of people went out on their own in the pandemic, right? And so
yeah.
And so part of the Great Resignation, so to speak, down letter, blah blah. But that the other part is go start your own business.
Yeah.
Become an independent contractor.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess it's just going to matter if the big question if this matters for our measure is going to depend on whether these guys are reported very different hours, desired hours versus the regular full-time or part-time employed they should be matched up to, and whether when we aggregate them with the kind of formally employed, we're kind of wiping that out. So I'm not sure. It's something we can kind of split the data and look at. But yeah, I mean, they're just going to get mixed in with the other 4 employment states we split up for what I'm going to show you.
I'm trying to think about this aggregation of the hours, and they said that you should think about, they should think about the reservation rates that we had before.
Mm-hmm.
But to some extent, some of those reservation rates will be off the market. In the sense that I might say, I want to work 8 hours a day, but only for $200 a day.
Yeah.
I feel
Right.
like that should be in the wage structure somehow.
It's so in some sense, I think we're the part of the reason we use this predicted desired hours within cells is that we're trying to get rid of that, and to the extent that would be showing up as some kind of spurious measurement error, sampling error, and so on. That's what we're trying to get, throw into the error term and throw out in our predicted estimates. But if there's some kind of systematic bias like that, and the sidebar I'll show you in a couple slides, there's a little worry about that, and we kind of just punt on the whole thing. But that's what we're trying to get with the predicted data. But if it's more systematic, then we're going to have a problem, and we haven't really done anything to deal with that. But we also, it looks the desired hours reporting, and when I show you the distributions, they seem to make sense. So if you see crazy things in the histograms, I'll show you in a couple slides, then we can bring it up again. Okay. So in terms of thinking about the aggregate hours gap as a weighted average, this is what it is here. So in the numerator, we just have this is the share of the CPS population in month T that's in labor force state J, one of those 9 states. And it's just the average difference between their desired hours, L, and their actual work hours, H. And that's just going to divide it by average desired hours, where the average is weighted against by labor force state. Okay. And in terms of putting it together, the desired hours is going to be this predicted estimate I was just talking about, the Ronnie. The actual hours is coming from the CPS individuals, and then the weights are just the aggregation of the CPS weight. These two things in turn are just averages across individuals. So the individual level match from the SCE data is this LDIT of this predicted estimate based on their demographics D and their labor force state J. And the T is really just a binary variable, whether it's before the pandemic or during the pandemic. And then the HGIT is actual hours as they reported in the CPS each month. And the WIJT is just the individual's population weight, which is just their sample weight. Okay. So when you put this all together, we already talked about this here. When you put this all together, the main thing to keep in mind is, how is this thing going to change over time? Where's that movement going to come from? Well, part of it's going to come from changes in labor force composition over time. So as people move and become employed, unemployed out of the labor force, that's going to change the share of the population in those groups. Demographic composition. So as the demographic composition of each of those things change over time, that's going to change the measure as well. So if women are laid off disproportionately more than men, vice versa, and change states more as a result, that's going to affect this measure through demographic composition. Obviously, changes in the work hours of the employed. So if a lot of people work 40 hours a week and they were mostly full-time employed, but all of a sudden they're stuck working 20 hours a week, that's going to show if there's underutilization our measure here through that. And then the change in desire to work hours that we estimate essentially is a binary drop pre-pandemic and then 2020, 2021. Okay. So no one's bugged me on this so far, so I'm not going to spend too much time given where I am on time now. But one thing to point out is that you can actually get negative hours gap. So people that essentially report that they're overworked, they're working more hours than they prefer at their current job. There's actually quite a bit of this in the data. It turns out it's a very nuanced issue that based on the point John was making earlier about thinking about underutilization as kind of search effort or search intensity, that these guys that are overworked actually exert, we looked at this quite a bit in the previous paper and a bit here, these guys exert actually quite a bit of search effort. And as a result, you would plausibly think they shouldn't be contributing negatively to Slack at the very least. But it's not clear how you would just put them in. You don't just want to put the absolute value of whatever their gap is in there. And reasons for that are related to some of the work I'm citing here. Bell and Blanchflower have a bunch of papers looking at these guys that have negative gaps and how they report their happiness, overall well-being, and so on. And there's a model out there from the 70s on multiple worker jobs and thinking about how people with two different wages, how to think about their indifference curves and where they are in terms of labor supply and so on. So the moral of the story is this is an issue. I'm actually going to show you both the positive and negative gaps in the histograms. But for all intents and purposes, we're just going to bottom code people at 0. So if you have a negative gap, we're going to count it as a 0 gap for today and and have that contribute to the measure. Okay. And this is just kind of showing the search relationships and so on to show that these guys with these guys with positive gaps or an absolute value kind of have the same relationship between their desired hours gap and their search effort. Okay. The main evidence. Let's start with desired hours and what they look like across the different groups. Okay. What you'll see here is the first column here is this adjusted desired hours across different labor force states over different periods, where the 2020, 2021 is the pandemic period, obviously, and then how much it changed between 2018-19 and 2020-2021. Okay. And what you'll see is, for the employed, there's a drop, but it's mostly driven by the part-time. Okay. For the unemployed, there's not too much of a difference. The other thing I want to point out here, too, is that on average and across all periods, the unemployed people generally prefer full-time jobs over 35 hours a week. A bit less than the full-time guys, but still, more than 35 hours a week. Those out of labor force are, and this is kind of key, what's driving everything going on here in terms of implications. Those out of labor force are preferring a decent amount of jobs per week. Those who say they want work, want close to full-time work, about 30 hours a week. but some of that dropped, or that has significant drop as well. And retired people look like they want to work about a day and a half a week. Those out of the labor force about 2 days a week. But this is really where we're seeing these drops and sizable drops in terms of desired work hours. Yes.
Can you attribute any of the drops to EI or COVID checks,
To what?
the employment insurances or COVID checks which were paid in the
Not directly. No. Okay. And then the other thing to kind of point out, like I said, the unemployed and the full-time workers, not too much of a change in their desired hours. It's really coming out of part-time workers, and then, like I said, to a greater extent, those guys out of the labor force. Okay. Across demographics, like I was telling Yana earlier, there's a pretty sizable drop for both men and women. It's not too different from each other. A sizable drop for both prime age and older workers. And the only place we really see a big difference in the drops is looking at some college or less versus those with college or more. We don't see too much of a change in desired hours among those with a college degree, but we do see a sizable decline among those guys with some college or less. Okay. So now I want to go through some histograms of what both the gap and desired hours look like. Okay.
Can I just ask, based on the demographics that you see, is there a way to predict how much they would have been receiving in pandemic payments and things like that? I think that would be interesting.
Yeah. In theory, I mean, we do have information on transfer payments. We don't ask anything specific about the stimulus payments and so on, but we've always had questions in there about UI and Social Security and so on. So, yeah.
But if there's a way to predict how much stimulus you got.
Yeah, based on family size and income and whether your husband or wife works and so on.
My understanding is that some of those payments were very large, some groups, especially lower.
Yeah, I think between the child tax credit and then as a fraction of your initial income, yeah, it's obviously increasing or increasing the lower wage you were. So that could be some of it. I mean, we could try to look at that in the SE. I think so. Okay, we're out of time. All right, 9 minutes. So the next, I got 3 things to show you, or 3 groups of things to show you here. The first group of things is what's going on with the histograms here. So this is all the employed. The left side here are the full-time guys. The right side here are part-time. The top 2 panels are the gaps, so desired minus actual. The bottom 2 are just desired hours by itself. Okay. So like I said, the big mass in the middle here is people right at 0 gaps. So in other words, these are people who you could argue are right on their labor supply curves. Their actual hours equal their desired hours. For full-time and part-time, to the left of that are people with these negative gaps I was mentioning. To the right of that with the positive gaps. You can see full-time guys, not too many positive gaps. Part-time, there is a bit. The main thing to point out here is that during the pandemic, so the pandemic is orange, pre-pandemic is blue. During the pandemic, many more people were on their labor supply curves in terms of working however many hours they preferred. And there were actually far fewer part-time workers that you can argue is part-time for economic reasons or involuntarily part-time, in the sense that there were fewer part-time workers working less hours than they preferred. Okay. Now, if we look at the actual hours they were preferring, and not just the gaps, you see among full-time workers, these changes they're not driven too much by changes in hours themselves. If anything, you see a slight rise in the amount of hours full-time workers prefer. And among part-time workers, you kind of see this move. There's much fewer part-time workers that preferred working full-time, and a lot more of them that preferred working part-time. Obviously, there might be some compositional changes going on in here. This is just grouping everybody together. That's kind of what's going on in the shift pre-pandemic post. The more interesting stuff is actually what's going on for guys out of the labor force. So on the right or on the left here is the change in desired hours for the unemployed pre and during the pandemic. And you see it's essentially the same. There's really no change. The bulk of these guys prefer full-time work. That didn't change during the pandemic. What did change here, and I want to kind of focus on what's going on here, right at 0 desired hours for those that are out of the labor force. Okay. And obviously, everything's kind of shifting towards this the 0 point during the pandemic. So the blue bar here, the numbers are a bit small. So pre-pandemic, on average, 41% of the people who are out of the labor force reported they wanted to work 0 work hours. So they had no desire to enter the labor force, whereas the remainder wanted to work, somewhere between primarily part-time. During the pandemic, that number went up to 50%. All right, so it's a 9 percentage point increase in the amount of people who are out of the labor force that are that say they just don't want to work any hours at all. And as I'm going to show you in the counterfactual exercises, these guys are playing a major role in what's going on for overall tightness in the labor market. So let's just look at the aggregate measure itself. So the thick blue line is the aggregate hours gap. The orange line is the BLS's unemployment rate. You can see these two things track each other pretty well up till the Great Recession, and they start diverging. The fact that the unemployment rate falls faster than the AHG following the Great Recession was kind of the point of the earlier paper. And then, the question is what's going on now? So since there's this big divergence going into the pandemic, we rescale things. So here on the left side is following the Great Recession, where I've normalized both measures to be at their average in 2007. And then on the right side, I normalize the average to what it is in 2019. Okay, so this shows it a little more clearly that pre-Great Recession, the AHG is saying the labor market's more sluggish than what the unemployment rate implies, and following the initial shock of the pandemic, the AHG is actually showing a faster decline to the point where it's actually below its pre-pandemic level relative to the unemployment rate. Okay. The more stark change is what's going on with labor force participation relative to what's going on to average desired hours reported. Okay, and you can see these two things actually track each other very well. There's a little bit of a difference in their recoveries following the Great Recession, but then they're kind of on top of each other again. But during the pandemic, desired hours drops by about twice as much as the labor force participation rate, and both of them remain persistently low through the end of 2021. So quite a ways after the initial hit.
Don't have to worry about scaling issues here a little bit.
So I've scaled this. Well, this one's a little hard. I've scaled this. So scaling issues here, I've scaled it so the percentage point changes are similar. This one, it's because they're two different measures. This is an average weekly hours measure. This is a percent of population measure. So it's really kind of like, what are these two things doing cyclically? The counterfactual exercise is going to take care of this stuff.
Yeah, we want to create indices and then like normalize the one and go to Anyway, you keep going. I'm
Okay.
Your time, Jason. Sorry.
I mean, potentially, yeah.
It's surprising, but if I read your earlier numbers before, it wasn't actually concentrated among the elderly, the decline in this diet was.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think half of that decline in the labor force participation rate, you can put that on like 60 to 70-year-olds. Now, right?
I think so. I'd have to go back and double check. There's a good chunk of that, but there was a bunch of people who were laid off right at the onset and just never came back. And I don't have a good idea. I can't remember offhand the demographic makeup of those guys. Okay, where am I on time? All right. So 3 minutes, right? Okay. So quickly, so we're able to break this measure out into different labor force components. I'm not going to get into too much of these details. The main point is, the main drops we see are among the part-time workers, and the out of the labor force for other reasons is a driver of this decline in the AHG. But there's still positive contributions for the employed. You can see the jaggedness kind of mostly related to change, rise and fall of COVID cases, and those that are out of the labor force but say they want work but didn't search. Quickly going through the counterfactual exercise. So like I mentioned, the counterfactual exercise is pretty easy to do. You just recalculate the aggregate hours gap from March 2020 forward, but using the 2013 to 19 desired hours. Okay, so that's what this figure shows here. So the light dashed blue line is what the aggregate hours gap would look like if desired hours didn't change, and as a result, you would have much more slack because desired hours contracted. And then here things are normalized. Here's your percentage difference from 2019 mean. So making John happy, thankfully. The drop here in potential hours, this is the actual. The blue line is the counterfactual. The main takeaway here is once we account for the change in desired hours across all groups, we can explain all of the difference or relative difference in how far these two measures fell between the participation rate and desired hours. Okay. And then this shows, if we look again by those components, looking actual versus counterfactual, where the dotted lines are the counterfactual, the solid lines are the actual. All of the action of what's going on with the counterfactual exercise is due to the changes among those guys out of the labor force. Okay, I'm gonna skip through these things quickly and just go to the supporting evidence. So in terms of supporting evidence, like I mentioned, there are some various questions we had in our survey, the BLS has in their survey, in terms of evidence on trying to get some evidence on whether or not this is due to COVID. I'm just going to go through three of them fairly quickly. The first thing is reservation wages. Okay, so the first thing we find in our survey, we have questions on the people's reservation wage. We can break it out by various demographic groups, obviously, and see how it changed over the period. And the main point is across, gender, age, and education, for the most part, we're seeing a rise and pretty comparable rises, about 5 to 7 log points in people's reported reservation wages. So they're requiring a higher wage to work during this period. Okay. The second thing I want to show is what I was mentioning earlier, is that we can also split people's out by their either occupation or industries, measure of what we call social proximity, which is essentially the interaction of this degree of social contact it requires multiplied by 1 minus the fraction that can work from home. And what you see here is the biggest drops are actually among the medium social proximity, but the high social proximity have drops as well. And those in the lowest social proximity, if anything, have slight rises in their desired work hours. And then the last thing I want to show you, so this graph uses the BLS data, is that the BLS directly asks people who are out of the labor force if they're not searching because of COVID. They use a very broad because of COVID question. They don't get very specific, but just because of COVID. And what you see here, so I'm going to focus on these are on different scales, but you can look at, they ask it for all people out of the labor force and everybody that's out of the labor force that wants work. About 9% of all people out of the labor force said yes, they were not searching because of COVID. And about 56% of those that said they want work said yes, they weren't searching because of COVID. But it drops throughout the pandemic to where, it's only about 1 percentage point by the end. So this can't explain why we still have persistently low desired work hours and low labor force participation by the end of December 2021. There has to be some kind of other changes that aren't due to COVID, because that's people are reporting that. And we essentially find the same phenomenon in our data, in our survey, because we ask questions, of everybody, all 3 labor force states, whether or not they searched due to COVID. And also we ask people if they were searching part-time, were they only searching part-time due to COVID. Okay, and we find, and we see that decline during 2021 as well. Okay. So just to conclude, we developed this aggregate hours gap measure during the COVID pandemic. It's showing showing a much tighter labor market than what the unemployment rate is showing. And the main reason is what I refer to as kind of this intensive margin or intensive adjustments for those on the participation margin. The fact that people who are out of the labor force are actually adjusting their desired work hours, and that's having a big effect on aggregate labor supply. Okay, so it's kind of a nuanced complement to the normal way we think about intensive versus extensive, which is employed people choosing either whether to work and then how many hours to work. These are people that are not even in the labor force making a similar choice, and even though they're not actually working, having a big effect here. So, thank you, Peter.